Welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast, now part of the Work-Defined Podcast Network. Join us as we explore the vital role of compensation, strategy, data, and people analytics in navigating today's complex business world. With the resources of Work-Defined, we're bringing you deeper insights and actionable ideas from top HR experts. Now, here are your hosts, David Turetsky and Dwight Brown.
This conversation is about compensation planning. And what I mean by compensation planning is, it's the actions that we take to deliver increases, awards of incentives or stock. So it's those processes that help us lead up to either leaders or owners or managers making decisions on people's pay and how much they get in that once a year, twice a year process. I'm going to get into who I am. I'm not going to spend a lot of time credentialing myself because you'll hear as we go through. I've spent a lot of time doing this as a practitioner as well as a consultant. Currently, I'm vice president of consulting at salary.com. I've been there for 4 years. And what I do is I help people like yourselves every day not only try and solve problems around compensation and HR technology, but it's my pleasure to actually help you learn about it. And so my process that I use is I go through and not only do the work with you, but I do it for you, and I show you how I do it so you can do it yourselves. I love to teach people on how to fish kind of scenario, where you're going to hire a consultant. You want to have a consultant who's going to teach you what you're doing so you can support it and you can answer the question, why the heck did you do this? Especially in the era of pay transparency, it's key for the people who actually make decisions or communicate things about pay to be able to understand how that was derived. I get a lot of times when I'm talking to a person in HR and they go, I don't know how this structure was put together. I don't even know what a structure means, but I need help. And so we spend a lot of time with companies figuring out not only what should structures be, but helping them understand what structures really are. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. So and by the way, again, military theme. As you can tell, I was not in the military. I wasn't built for it. We're going to talk about what makes up the compensation process, and specifically that process at the end, usually what we call it is the year-end processes, about awarding increases or awarding awards. We're going to talk about how comp professionals approach this. And so we're going to talk about those key components I was talking about. And then we're going to be able to give you some knowledge about how to actually talk about it. Now, if you hadn't seen it in the comments for the session, I wasn't allowed to actually upload the slides. I could have put it somewhere, but at the end of the day, if you go into the mobile app, my email address is there. Send me a note saying I want this, and I'll send you these slides. So again, let's talk about what comp planning is. There's a lot of words on this slide, so I'll let you read it for a second. But cutting through the BS, what it is it's all of those activities necessary to get the organization to a point where they can actually make good, solid compensation decisions on their people. And as I said before, sometimes these things are decided upon by leaders. Sometimes these things are decided upon by unions. Sometimes these are decided upon by law. But typically, when we're talking about increases and we're talking about awards of pay, there's a lot more that goes into it than just, oh, we're just going to give a 3% increase. Because a lot of things had to happen before that actually occurs. And we're going to go into that entire process. So we're going to talk about these three, actually there's more than three, but these are three critical ones: base pay, bonus, and incentives. If I asked you what base pay is in your organizations, a lot of you are going to give me similar answers, but it's never going to be exactly the same. You could say it's what people get paid for going to work. You could say it's what people get paid for working on an hourly basis. You could say it's what people get paid for the piece that they make, because there's piecemeal pay. There's a lot of different things that go into base salary. And in fact, if you're a salesperson, sometimes you get a draw, which isn't really base pay, but it helps you pay the bills. And draws, for those of you who don't know sales comp very well, draws are basically payments against future earnings around commissions that people get, again, to pay their mortgage while they're trying to go out and get those sales, but they owe it back to the company if they don't make those sales. Incentives are the second two pieces. A bonus is typically described as a discretionary payment for reward. And by the way, I don't really think there's much of a difference between the incentives and the bonus. We use those words interchangeably in compensation. And the reason why we do that is we want to confuse you. For those of you who have bonus programs, all they are incentive programs. And for those of you who have incentive programs, they're fancy ways of saying you have bonus programs. And by the way, I've designed lots of plans for lots of companies, and they use these two words interchangeably. So don't focus on that as much. Equity. You know, people say, oh, well, equity, that's DE&I. No. The government hasn't scrubbed this part of the web for this. Equity is the portion of an incentive that is paid in the form of stock units. For those of you who have stock units, or those of you who are not listed on a stock exchange, sometimes those things are called phantom units. Sometimes they're called performance shares. Sometimes they're called restricted shares. Sometimes they're called stock options. But it's a form of compensation that has the derivative product is a piece of stock. So it's ownership in the company, and it aligns that employee with the long-term success of your organization. So when you give it to somebody, it doesn't have to be a leader, it doesn't have to be an executive, but if you give it to somebody, what you're basically saying is, I want you around for a long time, and I want you to affect the overall value of this company. Another one, which is something similar to the three things we saw before, variable pay. That's an incentive. That's a bonus. The reason why we call it variable pay is, anybody ever, without reading that? It's variable. It's not guaranteed. Not guaranteed. So you go in this year the person earns $10,000 for a bonus. Next year, they're starting at zero. Because it's variable. They could get 20, they could get 0. Okay? And the last one for this page is total compensation. Again, we use a lot of words to describe total compensation. Some of you may have heard total cash. Some of you may have heard total cash, total direct compensation, total rewards. For those of you who are a rewards professional, we know total rewards includes everything, including benefits. And total direct compensation means base pay, incentives, bonus, stock, and other ancillary cash plans that lead to what we call also total cash compensation. Then there's overtime. Overtime is going to be talked about this year, next year, the year after, because it's been in the news a lot from politicians talking about it. I'm not getting political here when I say this. Overtime is a key component of a lot of your employees' pay. They rely on it to pay the bills. It's not like a bonus. Overtime is a regulatory item. It is something that like it should, Department of Labor cares about. And the FLSA is there for a reason. It's protecting workers for getting paid for the work hours that they put in. There's going to be a lot of talk about it because, again, a lot of confusion about it right now. At the end of the day, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you legal advice here, but at the end of the day, if you have someone marked FLSA non-exempt and they're eligible for overtime, no one's going to bat an eye. The moment you start trying to play games with exempt and non-exempt on overtime, that's when you might get into trouble. Again, it may not go to court anymore, but this is really important to employees. By the way, if you think I'm spending a lot of time on this, it's because this sets the foundation for the stuff we're going to be talking about in a little bit. Another one which has had a lot of headlines about taxation is tips. There are a lot of people who, when you go to the cash register these days and they haven't done a darn thing for you, ask if you want to give them a tip. And some people who go, yeah, sure, I'll give them 15, 20%. Other people go, but you just took my order. I'm going to go somewhere else and get it, like Dunkin' Donuts, for example. People who get paid on tips get paid a much lower rate of pay. And so for some of those people, especially servers, they rely on that for a living, okay? And again, not getting political about it all, but this is going to become an even more emotionally charged item over time. And if you have a lot of people who are on tips, I would look at managing their total compensation. There's a company that I'm going to be working with soon, I think, that wants to talk about the words living wage. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's how much do people really need to live? So we pay them certain monies, but like if they're getting paid their minimum base on tips, is that supporting them? Can they actually live off that? And the last one is perquisites. And for those of you who don't know what perquisites are, they're the things we give to executives or people that we call perks. It used to be a company car. It used to be a membership to a non-nightclub, but to a, actually in some industries that's true, to a social club or other things, memberships to health fitness centers and things like that. But it's not just executives. Perquisites can be given to more people. And they're typically done for executives or given to executives.
What happens when employees behave badly? Boy, we could do an entire TV show, maybe a Netflix special on that. Well, Ryan and I sat down and recorded episodes for FAMA, and we asked practitioners, give us your most outrageous story. The sales leader that brings cocaine to work, whatever. Just bring us the outrageous, and it is funny. So if you need a laugh, which we all do from time to time, search for workplace misconduct wherever you get your podcast, and you'll find it. And trust me, you will laugh and cry, but you'll definitely laugh. All right. Thank you.
So what we've been talking about, let me give you some kind of undercurrents for how compensation works. And I hate this build, so I'm just going to get to the end. So as I said before, compensation planning isn't just the act of making a merit increase. It's not the act of giving the bonus. It has a lot of things that go along with that starts at the very beginning and starts with things like a pay philosophy. How many of you have a stated pay philosophy on your website? Okay, I call that an opportunity. What we mean by a pay philosophy is, why do we pay you what we do? What we do. The second thing is, so that's strategy. The second thing is job analysis, which is the ability for you to understand the value of a job relative to other jobs in your organization. Sometimes it's called job evaluation. Sometimes it's called grading. Sometimes it's slotting. But it gives you an opportunity to say, what are these jobs relative to each other and what salary band do they fit in? And why that's key is because a lot of the things we use salary structures for and salary grades are trying to determine what is this job in the market, how much am I paying it here versus what's the market for this job, and our salary structure is the kind of the representation of our market, and where is this person in their journey, in their career, and how much am I paying them against that? And so that's job analysis. Market analysis is understanding your jobs relative to the markets for which you compete for talent. So you could call it market pricing. Again, it's a form of job analysis. But what we do is we go into the marketplace and we look for companies like yourselves, the size, the revenue, or the location, and we try and say, what does this job get paid in your area? Now, some of you are in remote areas, so you have a very small job market. You have small areas to pull from labor, and we need to make sure that we're giving you an accurate analysis, and you need to make sure you're doing an accurate analysis to understand how much should I be paying these people. The next is internal analyses. We used to call this internal equity, and a lot of people still do. But if you look at a job and you do a salary or a total compensation, high to low, and you look at people and you go, wow, this person's got 50 years experience and this other person has 2 years experience, and we're paying them the same amount. That's what we talk about as an internal equity analysis or internal analysis. Why are they paid what they're paid? And what are we going to do about it? Is that fair? Once you have all of that background information, then you have a plan, or then you have an ability to go to your managers and say, here's the context for making a pay decision. Here's all the information that we can provide you. Now, by the way, alongside of that, we're going to give them the salary structures. We're going to give them what we call guidelines. What can you give people? There's a budgeting process that we hadn't talked about where we've sat with our CFO Or we talk to our finance people and we say, what can we afford to pay? We just came out with our salary budget survey, or it's actually imminently coming out. I'm actually going to be giving a presentation on it in a couple of weeks. Or is it next week? And one of the things that's fascinating about the data that we found is that increases are going to be lower next year than they were last year. Does that shock anybody? I'm glad, because you're right. But what surprises me is they're not much lower. They're still talking about giving the people who responded to the survey 3.5% for an increase. But that's a total increase amount. 3.5%, it's a lot. Some have said 4%. Could you imagine going to your CFO and saying 4% for an increase this year? With all the undercurrents of what's happening in the job market, for all the people losing their jobs, for the uncertainty of what's going on in the economy, well, that's where people are right now. Now, whether they wind up with that in January when they're actually giving out increases is different. But all of this sets context. The next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be implementing our plan. We've trained our managers. We've given them the details of what's happening in the market, and for the market for jobs, the market for their people, the internal analysis. We've given them all the salary structure stuff. And now we start communicating all these things to employees and managers. Here's what is all going on. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Let them all know what's happening. And then we get the data back and we adjust. Why do we have to adjust? Anybody want to venture a guess? Managers stink at saying, I'm going to do what you tell me to do. I'm just going to give what I want. Anybody ever hear of the peanut butter approach? No? It's a great one. I'm going to give everybody the budget, no matter what they perform at. Whether they come to work every day and they bust it all, they're leaving it all on the field, or whether they come, they clock in, they go home, they grumble when they go to the water cooler. I believe in pay for performance, meritocracies, but what we find is that after we've done these plans, after we've gone through and done everything, that managers need help, and one of those ways is for us to actually change things. So, as I said before, the things that underlie the planning process, it's budgeting, it's talking to your CFO. Does anybody know what accrual processes are? So for those of you who have incentive plans, you just can't give out money at one point in the year without it really affecting your balance sheet, without it affecting your numbers. So what the finance organization does is they go through a process each year where they put aside money on the books, so it's not this major impact at the end of the year. So you're adding it into your financials throughout the fiscal year. We call that accruals. And what I used to do as a practitioner is I used to run a report, and I used to take the target incentive for every person, and I used to add it up, and I used to give that to my finance people. And what they do is they'd have a holding place on the books for 100% payout at target for everybody who was incentive eligible. And what that enabled them to do, as I said, is not mess up the financials for the year end. Because when we got to the process of year end, and if we had a great year, even having those bonuses in the plan, we had a great year, they might give us a little bit more money to increase that pot and be able to give everybody more. And if we had a bad year, they may actually pull that money back from us, and we'd take a multiplier approach of discounting that money, and everybody get paid less on their incentives. The year-round processes that happen that underlie planning are promotions or market adjustments that you might have to give throughout a year because people leave, people have to get promoted, people may get an increase because they did a course on something and it was more value to their job, so you want to give them a little bit of a bump in pay. Also, you might find that you looked at the market and people are underpaid and you don't want them to leave. You're also getting survey data back all the time nowadays. You're getting surveys back all the time, and that survey might show you that your people are way underpaid, and you have to fix it. So let's talk about the people who are typically in the planning process. Typically, executives and senior managers. They certainly play a leadership role in the how this happens, but they also play a role in how much it happens, or what happens. But they also might be not only approvers, but in some circumstances, they may be the people who are actually doing the planning. For those of you who have long-term incentive plans, the equity I was talking about before, A lot of times, we just give them the opportunity to give their people equity. I designed an equity plan at a 100-year-old medical device manufacturer, and for the first time ever, they were giving everybody at every level the opportunity to have it if they were outstanding performers. And so after we went through the performance management cycle, we gave the executives the opportunity to give certain people who were rated outstanding equity. Because whether you were the janitor and you were making sure that the floors were clean so that people didn't get hurt on the manufacturing floor, whether you were the person who was the planner who got materials in just in time and saved us a bunch of money, and they really helped us in our bottom line, those people impacted the organization, so they were given stock because we wanted to align them long-term with the value of the company. Obviously, your HR professionals, you and your comp people certainly are involved. They're the people who lead the process. Department heads and managers usually are the people who are lifting this like Atlas on their shoulders and doing a lot of the work. I just want to ask a stupid question before we continue. How many of you have planning processes where supervisors and managers do the planning for annual increases? Well, only two people?
What do you mean by planning? Like,
that's what we're talking about. Giving increases, deciding on increases, deciding on, okay. And so there are other ways in which we do this. Again, as I said before, sometimes unions decide, sometimes agreements decide how much people get paid, but a lot of times the department heads and managers who are making these decisions, they're the people who have this on their shoulders. Obviously, as we talked about before, we can't do this without our CFOs and our brethren in the finance organization. They help us along the way, especially with the accrual process, but also making sure we can afford to do what we want. And I know this is going to sound funny, but the employees are very much a part of this process. They're important because, yeah, their favorite four-letter word that comes to compensation is usually what?
Fair.
What?
Fair.
I wish that was it. More, thank you so much. It's our favorite thing we want to hear. I literally, as a compensation professional, I was a department manager, and I had a conversation with somebody once, and I said, she actually was in compensation. And I said, you know that the merit budget is 3% this year. I had to do a lot of soul searching, and I was able to get you a 10% increase. And she said, oh, that's disappointing. I expected more. And she left the organization shortly thereafter. And I said, well, while it's regrettable, thank you very much for your help. You've been awesome. I appreciate your service. Goodbye. Because I didn't need that. But they give you great feedback on whether or not that was what they expected, whether that was what they wanted, whatever. But, as we know, sometimes you can't match expectations because people think about more. That is the underlying tenet of compensation. You give them 10%, they wanted 15. You give them 3%, they wanted 6%. It happens like that all the time. There's nothing we can do about it. It just is what it is.
Enjoying the conversation? Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode packed with insights and strategies. Now, let's dive back in.
I did a webinar a few weeks ago on merit increases. Actually, it's probably a month ago now. The underlying tenet of my presentation was pay for performance is what drives a lot of organizations. Merit increases do not drive different behaviors. It does not pay for performance. Does anybody know why? Let me rephrase it for everybody because it's exactly the right answer. So what she said was that it's not effective anymore. 3% just doesn't cut it. People expect more. They want 6% if you've given 3%. It's not an effective approach. Why? If you give 6%, if you have a team of 2, if you're going to give 6% to somebody, what does that mean for the other person? They're getting 0, right? We've done so many layoffs. We really rarely have bad performers on our teams, right? How can you give a good performer a 0? Cost of living is increasing for them. Inflation is driving prices through the roof. Go buy a carton of eggs still. It's still expensive. And so the concept of merit increases make a lot of sense when you have a 10% increase budget, when you have a 6% increase budget. How many people remember 10% increase budgets? Come on, there are some people who are old as me. You're not. So I remember those days, and we haven't seen them in at least 40 years. It hasn't happened in a long time. So you can't give people, again, we talk about living wage, you can't give them a living increase on that unless you take other people down to zero, and a lot of people. And so that means you get only a couple of haves when you have a ton of have-nots on your team. And that might be true because of performance, but as I said, because of layoffs, I dare find terrible performers on your team. But I've gone off topic. Merit increases is the ability for your organization to give out increases. Typically, these are done on an annual basis at one time during the year. There are some companies who still give anniversary increases, right? The anniversary of someone started. I'm going to keep going because this all makes total sense, I'm sure, because you pay merit increases based on the job they do with internal equity, about performance and job value. Again, let's talk about variable pay because this kind of encompasses a lot of different things. Variable pay is the concept of being able to give someone an award at a time during the year truly on a pay-for-performance basis. The organization's performed, the individual's performed, and therefore I'm giving them a payout of some sort. A Christmas bonus doesn't really align to this. A Christmas bonus is a thank you for sticking around bonus. So if you still do that, that's great. And I'm sure people value it, and I'm sure it helps them be able to pay for the way in which their kids get Christmas presents. But what we're talking about here is really an ability to reward employees for the job they do. And it's great. It's really important. I align this much more to pay for performance than I do to merit, because if the person does great and the company does great, then you can pay out. Because what I call self-funding, these things are self-funding. If the company does well and the person does well, then they get a payout. It's a contract. If the company does poorly, but the employee does well, sometimes finance will allow us to scrape together some money to give them. But the formula typically is that if the company does poorly, that no one gets paid on these plans. It's the same thing for bonuses. Typically, when bonuses are discretionary, especially for non-exempt employees, when these are discretionary, people don't think of them as guarantees. Discretionary means that we have the ability to make a decision on this award. It's not guaranteed. Okay? But again, it goes back to their achievements. I don't see any difference between variable pay and bonuses, so I'm sorry. But this is important. So the way that they're measured, typically, there's a person measurement, there's a team or department measurement, there's company performance. Sometimes, if you work for organizations that have projects, like I used to build compensation plans for Accenture and Deloitte, they have teams, but when teams finish a project, they get a payout, and they get an incentive on that project, and then they move on to another team. Totally different, or maybe it's the same, but now they're eligible for a new incentive based on the performance of that project, okay? And so they go team to team to team, and sometimes actually in manufacturing this works as well. There's safety measurements, there's productivity measurements, there's defect measurements that go into it that the team shares, but what did the individual contribute to that to get it? If it's discretionary, that means a manager or a team lead or somebody has the ability to make a decision to say, you are great. You're going to get 150% of that bonus. You are amazing, but unfortunately, I'm going to give you 175% of that bonus. And I was poor, so I get 0%. I didn't show up. I didn't do my job. And so what we're doing in that part of the presentation is we're setting up context, and now we're going to keep going. I think you guys understand personal performance gets measured like for performance evaluations and things like that. Company performance is typically measured on financial performance. There's a whole thing about, anybody care about EBITDA? Anybody want to spend time? All right, so EBITDA is one of those things that everybody thinks they know the definition of. it's that one thing that we kind of forget all the time. It's earnings before something. Well, we have it here. It's interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Ostensibly, this is a way for all companies to be able to measure the same thing across organizations. It's a GAAP measurement or a GAAP measurement where they've defined how this thing should be. A lot of companies use this because it's a good target for people to use to understand how well the company did. A lot of times, EBITDA is one of the financial metrics that executives use when determining their executive pay. And for those of you who don't know executive pay very well, there's this thing called a proxy. A proxy is what companies who are listed on stock exchanges are required to put out, and it's a description of why they get paid what they get paid. There's other things in there, but one of the fascinating things it talks about the top 5 people in your organization, the top 3 or 5 people paid in your organization, and how their pay is determined. It's regulated, it has to be there. And EBITDA is usually one of the ways in which we determine that. Typically, and I'm going to cut through this for a second. Oops. EBITDA is kind of that company portion, is usually judged as a company portion of incentives. If we do well and we hit our EBITDA targets, you get the payment. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll say if we reach 65% of EBITDA target, you get nothing. If you reach 85% of company target, that's the threshold, you get something. You get maybe 85% of the payout. If you hit 100%, you get 100%, and if we go higher than that, you might get 125 or 150% of your payout. That's usually how EBITDA is built, or impacts the system. I spend a lot of my day helping companies build commission plans. Anybody here deal with commissions at all with salespeople? What's the fun thing about commission plans with salespeople? It goes back to what somebody said here. It's about more. They love trying to find those angles in your commission plan, not to game them necessarily, but to be able to find the right level of pay and the right level of effort. How much do I have to expend for this month or this quarter to earn what I need to? And that's what we have to make really clear in our commission plans. In fact, I spend a lot of time helping people understand that the simpler the commission plan, the less they're going to game your system, and the more effective they're going to be. And first they challenge it and they go, no, we got to lock it down. We can't let them get away with gross margins. We can't let, the gross margins have to be profitable for the company. I'm like, yeah, okay. But you're talking about rules. You're not talking about the commission plan. What I'm talking about the commission plan is giving them a formula to say, like I talked about before on EBITDA, if they reach 85%, up to 85% of their plan, they get nothing. If they reach 100%, they get 100%. And if they reach higher than that, they'll get a multiplier. And they go, oh, that's great. Okay, how do you come up with a plan? Well, what's your numbers? What's your budget for them making for each of the individual people? Let's talk through that, and then let's talk about it with the leaders of the sales team and see if they think they can sell that. That was a pun, selling it to a salesperson. Sorry. I'm a dad, so my dad jokes are awful. The short-term incentives, we've talked about it a number of times. Sometimes these are annual incentives, sometimes these are short-term incentives. Long-term incentives are the stock things. We've talked about that. Sometimes I feel like the people who built this deck wanted to beat you over the head with lots of jargon. I want to try and get to, because we have only 28 minutes left, I want to get to kind of the most important stuff. Let's talk about timeframes. Typically, budget timeframes are kind of now. They're kind of the end of the summer, early fall. We're talking about how much we're going to set aside, how much we have the ability to pay in terms of our bonuses, in terms of our merit increases for next year. This is the time when we should be in the office of our CFO as comp or HR professionals going, here's what we heard the market's going to do based on the surveys that have come back. Here's what we've heard from business leaders as to what they need. Here's what our surveys are telling us in terms of where we are in the market. And here's how much we think is going to happen. The last few lines on this, the last few phrases on this, financial performance, the CFO will help us with. The market conditions. Does anybody have a good handle on what's going on in the economy today? Because if somebody raises their hand, I'm going to buy you a drink after. Because I've been an economist. I graduated with a degree in econometrics and economics. I got to be honest, I've never in my life lived in a world where I'm so uncertain as to what's going to happen with the economy. And I think this is scaring a lot of people. This is scaring a lot of employees right now. Oops, I thought it was this one. This thing right here, the market conditions. If you're in the federal government, you're scared. If you're in state governments, you're scared. If you're in municipalities, you're not so scared, but you're a little afraid because those grants that you need and a lot of the funding you get from the federal government is up in the air. If you're in academics, you're scared. The reason why I keep bringing this up is because people aren't necessarily worried about their increase next year. They're worried about having a job next year. And so the more you can communicate, even if you're giving increases and everything's all the same, the more you can communicate, hey, we're doing okay, or hey, we're not doing so well. So the more you can over-communicate that, the more people are going to appreciate it, especially when you get your employee surveys back. But the reason why I'm bringing this up here is because it's the important time to sit down with your CFO and talk about how much you need for next year. This is the perfect time to talk about if we're not going to get increases, what are we doing? When it comes to merit, as I mentioned before, sometimes increases happen yearly through a focal process, we call it, and sometimes they happen on an anniversary basis. How many of you do a focal merit increase or a focal annual increase? Should be most of you these days. Yeah. And how many of you do anniversary dates still? Yeah. It's still around, and many companies still stick with it. The reason why a lot of companies have moved from the anniversary basis to an annual basis is it's easier to budget for an annual than it is an anniversary. Because sometimes if people have anniversaries in January, February, March, April, they get all the money, and if the money evaporates, the people on the back end of the year are like, what about us? Well, we lost the budget. No, that shouldn't happen. It should be solid in the financial plans, but it could happen. Bonus timeframes are usually common. They're usually on quarterly basis. Sometimes they're on monthly, if they're manufacturing or if they're more like commissions. But they're mostly quarterly. Sometimes they're semi-annual, but most of the time they're annual. And the reason why they're mostly annual is because we true up with finance at the end of the year. Even if they're quarterly, we might have 3 different quarters, but the 4th quarter is the true up based on the based on the annual. And usually that 4th quarter is either the biggest piece or it's the piece where we give them that kicker that the company's done really well. The one thing I'd say is commissions are usually monthly. Sometimes companies do quarterly commissions because the business cycles that happen on a monthly basis are too much, and it's too much to actually do the administration of commissions on a monthly basis for some organizations, so they do it quarterly. The reason why we typically love to have annual planning as well for merit increases or annual increases is because performance management's really key in being able to make sure that we get the right answer. And so typically when we do our performance evaluations, which are typically once a year, we get all that information and that backup to be able to make that decision. And so the manager and the employee have a good understanding about if they've done the appropriate work on the performance evaluation, and they take all that work and they bring that into the compensation process, and again, they're paying for performance, then the employee at least understands why I'm getting paid what I'm getting paid. Sometimes that doesn't actually happen. So let's talk about a couple different case studies about, and these are real world scenarios, sort of. I'm sure they're cobbled together from a lot of different ones, where small to mid-sized companies do compensation planning. A lot of employees have individual bonus targets. The way I like to set bonus targets are using grades. I usually say, well, this top grade gets a 50%, the next one down gets a 35%, whatever. So it's very transparent who has what bonus target. Because trying to manage individual targets is kind of a nightmare. Anybody have a good HRIS? That's where it should go. A lot of times we have this thing called a piece of paper, which is their offer letter, which is where those typically stay. And it's not good when you go through a bonus process and people go, that's not my percentage. Where'd you get that from? Oh, we thought you were like everybody else. No, look at my offer letter. I've had that happen more often than not. So again, we use that annualized pay. Sometimes we use actual pay. And what I mean by actual pay is we take their bonus percentage and we take their earnings for the year. Why would I do that? Earnings are prorated. So if someone was out on leave, if someone didn't work a full year, they're prorated. Proration means that if someone didn't work the full cycle, they didn't work the whole year, that they're only getting a bonus based on the time they actually spent in their job, in the company. And so if you use actual earnings, then basically what you're doing is you're prorating their incentive and you're giving base earnings as a basis times their bonus percentage. It's fair. It's not about saving money, it's about actually paying them for the time they spent at the company, which is very much in many of the incentive plans that you've developed or that your company has developed and use. Then the manager takes a look at that and they say, wow, they did a great job. Again, you got 175%, you got 150% of plan, and David got 0. That's the manager discretion, that's the manager planning. So we've given all the background to the manager, we've done our performance evaluation, we've made sure everybody understands, and then the managers get the chance to say what about it, and they get to make a decision. And here, similar situation. What I wanted to do is I wanted to try and get to, and again, if you get the presentation, you'll get all this. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to show you this. This is kind of the crux of it. This is giving the managers a spreadsheet which shows them what their base pay is, those eligible earnings I was talking about before, and you could see in a lot of cases, people didn't stay or they weren't there a whole year. Can you all see that? And so sometimes if you look at the top two numbers, those people they weren't there that whole year. In fact, that second person shows a 0 next to their name. Why do you think they show a 0 next to their name? Exactly. They weren't there for the cutoff date. Thank you. They weren't there for the cutoff date. So what happens is, if they're not there for the full time, then they don't get their bonus. Or we're adjusting their bonus to be 0 for the target. But in this case, the manager decided to override that, and they gave $600 anyways. Now, by the way, if I'm on a base pay of $160,000 and someone gave me $600, after tax, that's not going to be very much. So you know what I might say to my manager? Keep it. Give it to someone else. Thank you. And by the way, I've said that before, not sarcastically. I've said, look, don't give me a token amount. Give it to someone else who's done a really good job. And it wasn't because I was being mean or nasty or emotional about it. I'm sure some of that was in the back of my mind. But I basically said, give it to someone else. But you could see in this scenario, and this is a very basic scenario, that managers get the opportunity to make adjustments here, they can give notes here, but at the end of the day, that thing on the right-hand side, that column, that's what payroll is going to use to actually give out these increases. Do y'all do something like this? Yeah, I mean, this is kind of normal. This is what we typically do. There are a couple of problems with this. One problem is that first of all, I don't see what my budget is. If I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, my budget should be my annual base times the percentage, so I'm missing some information here that gives me context, okay? A lot of these type of spreadsheets have a budget column. They have, well, what can you spend? Because you don't want managers going rogue and saying, I'm going to give everybody more. Because what will happen is they'll get the spreadsheet back and it'll have everybody slashed, and managers don't really react well to that. Or they go to their boss, and they go to that boss, and they go to their boss, and they go to the CEO, and they go, you didn't tell me. So a lot of the things that I'd be looking for here would be adding a budget column, and then as they spend the money in the manager adjustment, the budget column goes down until it gets to $0 outstanding, dollars to spend. Another one, which is that client wants all employees to have skin in the game, which means that they can lose it all. Employees are given an annual individual rating. Each plant score is calculated by finance. The two scores are combined to give a payout. Let's look at what this looks like. Come on. So while this might be complicated, and it is, there's a lot more information on here about making the decision. A lot more information. First of all, I see what's the plant contribution to this incentive, and you can see that with that top line. Anybody venture a guess what plant one's contribution was here? It's not a trick question. It's 85.5%, right? So the person's weighted, I don't know if you could see this here. Plant one, the person's bonus target is 5%. They earn $75,600. The weighting for the plant is 25%, and the score was 85.5%. So at the end of the day, instead of having 5%, a full 5% times 25%, they're getting it discounted by 14.5%. So the bonus payout is down. Oh, you can see it, the percent difference is 14.5%. Whereas the person got a performance score of 4, the manager gave 1, so they're actually getting 100% of their target. So they're only down by almost 4% in their payout. So the manager decided in this case for plant 1 that they're going to give this person at target, even though the plant did poorly, but because they got a performance score of 4, they were given a 1. And you could see that there are guidelines on the right-hand side that stipulate you can give between a 0.96 and a 1 if they get a performance score of 4. This tells a great tale. This gives you a story to tell. I can tell the person did well, or they did well enough. The plant suffered a little bit. Not terribly, but they got 85% of their score. Maybe there were a couple of incidents. Maybe their quality wasn't as high. By incidents, I mean like safety incidents, or there was loss, there was theft, whatever. At the end of the day, in this intermediate scenario, plant 1 did 85%. Now plant 10 did well. They got 1.03%. They got 103% of plan. And in this case, that person got 5. They got 125% of plan. And so they got 20% more on their incentive for this period of time. Think about the messaging in both cases. If you were that HR person, what story would you tell the person from plant 1 versus the person from plant 10? How did they contribute? Well, obviously they were 5, right? They were a really good contributor. So they're aligned with the incentive mechanism, very much so, because plant 10 did well and the person did well, so they drove the plant to do better, and they got 20% more because of that. And that's actually real money. That's pretty good. Now in this case, let's look at plant 7. Plant 7 did a 98.75% score. The person got a 4, and that translated, the person got a 99%. So they're about 1.2% less. Again, not a terrible communication, but the plant didn't do well, even though the person was fine. They got a 4. The reason why I'm talking about the story is because incentive plans only work if the manager and the employee have a conversation and there's communication about why this happened. Has anybody ever received a bonus without being told why? Oh, I'm serious. Has anybody ever received a bonus without? Yeah. What's the first thing that you feel when you get that bonus and you see it in your paycheck before someone talks to you about it? What is it based on? Why? What's this for? I've been given incentives and never had a conversation with my boss. Now remember, I'm a rewards professional for 35 years. I worked for a very large company for 16 years. And in many of those years, my boss lived in a completely different part of the country. And this was before Zoom. So you'd have expected them to call me into their office. I would fly out there, go into their office, or you'd expect me to at least have a phone call. Say, hey, David, next week we're going to get our incentives, and I just wanted to let you know you're getting a 95% on your incentive because the business didn't do well, even though I gave you 100% of your rating. Here's how we're going to improve on that next year. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you some support. You're going to ask me for things more proactively. I know there were things that I didn't give you, so I'll do better. That's a story. That's a reason why that is now an investment in you and in the people. that are paying this, which is your shareholders. Could you imagine a shareholder finding out that you wasted money? And shareholders in your case might be your municipality, it might be your board of directors, it might be your owners. No one likes wasting money, and that lack of a story is a waste of money. So I went through these things very fast because I wanted to save time at the end. What questions you have, and by the way, it could be of anything compensation, because we were talking about just giving increases in awards and shares and stock and bonuses today, but what questions do you have? Okay, so her question is, she works at a nonprofit, how do they base their awards when they don't have targets on revenue and they don't have profitability and things like that? And the answer is there's a lot of metrics you can come up with your board of directors that enable them to say, how are we doing? One of them is, did you do the outreach you were supposed to? How many people did you see? How many people did you help? How many people did you talk to? What were your fundraising goals versus what were they actually, what was the achievement of fundraising goals? There are a lot of things that are not necessarily based on that EBITDA that I showed you before, but are still critical in the success of your organization. Nonprofits are just like every other company. You have to turn the lights on in the morning, you have to have people working for you. There's a mission though, right? I did some work with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society one time, and they said, yeah, we have great people who are on our phones who are trying to raise funds. They really believe in the cause, but they're not really good at raising funds. And I said, well, you have to get rid of them. And you have to bring in people who are salespeople. And by the way, I wasn't being nasty. Because people who believe in the cause should be doing other things, should be volunteering in other places. When you're talking about people who fundraise, what's the one thing they have to do? Bring in money. They have to sell. You have to bring in good salespeople. And what do you have to do with good salespeople? You have to incentivize them. You have to give them plans. You have to pay them. And so he said, I don't know if I can do that. I have to talk to my board. And he talked to the board, and the board's like, that's a great idea. Listen, you don't have to love their methods. But if you don't buy people who can get you the revenue you need, you will not survive. And for those of you who know what the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society do, they are trying to eradicate bloodborne diseases in children. And so you can't help but love that mission. But no one's just going to write a check based on that. And so they needed to hire people, but more so, they needed to give them an incentive mechanism. And I said, when we build your sales plan, we're going to make it, again, super aggressive, just like we would if you worked at a car dealership. He's like, it's not us. I'm like, yeah, I know, but it needs to be you. Because if it isn't you, then you're not going to get the funds you need to survive. Again, he went back to his board and they agreed. It's a great question. So my advice is sit with your board and talk to them about the metrics that matter. And that's a way in which you can create the mechanism for how you judge people and how you judge yourselves. Now, again, if it's a meritocracy and you're giving merit increases, it might be, what are the personal goals that people have? And you might start with, what are the foundational goals? And then go from there. Any other questions? Someone had asked a question online. I wanted to answer it. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm going to the app. Advice for when your leader is willing to spend money on every recruiting, retention strategy, and gimmick except compensation. Okay. It's a great question. I'm going to go back to a different example in my career where I was helping a company build a sales plan, and I was trying to sunset a sales plan where, and I'm being very straight up with you, a person in sales could earn much more by spiffs than they could from commissions. Do you know what spiffs are? Spiffs are contests. Spiffs are awards if someone makes the first sale of the month. They get an award. So what the sales leaders had done is they realized this is unregulated money and they could create whatever spiff program they wanted. And they love it. Why do they love it? They don't have to ask for approval. They can do whatever they want. Well, this company had 20, and I'm serious, 20 double-sided pages of spiffs. And their awards earnings on spiffs were sometimes double, quadruple, 10 times what they could have made on their commissions. And I said, cut all that out, maybe have 1 or 2 spiffs that are really important to you, and put all that money into your commissions. Why? Do spiffs drive sales? Exactly. Like, I love, that's exactly right. It's not just what makes them feel good. It has to drive the results. So a spiff is the first sale of the month, the last sale of the month, the sale, bless you, the quickest sale. Like I met them and they signed right on the dot. But that's not going to make your numbers. It's not going to get you the revenue you need. So the commission has to do that. So while 1 or 2 of those is fine, having them be multiples of your commission plans is not. So my advice to you, whoever asked that question, is get down to the crux of what is your recruiting problem. Is the recruiting problem we're not paying enough? Is your retention problem we're not paying enough? Go to your return on investment type part of your mind. Try and work with your leadership to ask the questions of what's going to keep people in our seats? What's going to make people happy? It's not gimmicks or gadgets. And it's not about getting a t-shirt that has your brand on it. That stuff plays well for certain roles. It doesn't get your shareholders excited. So make sure when you're designing your compensation plans that you have the ability, especially when you're getting manager input and you're getting employee input, ask them what's important to them. And what are they going to always say? Money, more. I have to pay my rent. I can't pay my rent with a shirt. Doesn't work that way. Unless they're getting signed Titans logoed stuff and then they can sell it on eBay or whatever these kids are selling these days. But I'm being facetious, but that's the case, is that you have to be able to give them money to pay their rent. And investing in other things isn't going to do that. It's certainly not going to get your engagement scores up. Anybody else have any other questions? Yeah. So for the people who didn't hear down there, it's what are the positives and negatives, and I'll start with the negatives. What are the positives and negatives with the approach of going from an annual increase cycle to a quarterly increase cycle? I'll start out with the most important one, which is it becomes an administrative burden on supervisors and managers to have to constantly be in the process of doing these things. It's an extremely emotional process to give an increase. For those of you who have not done it before, giving that increase is emotional to the manager because they have to then have that communication with the employee about what was their performance translating to in terms of pay. And in the era of pay transparency, it's going to get easier because all the mechanisms are going to be out in the open. And by the way, I know Tennessee doesn't have that yet, but everybody else does, and everybody else is going to be more transparent. So you might want to start thinking about how do you become that. So first of all, it's an administrative burden, and it's emotional to the manager. The second of all, finance might not like that at all because you're giving the money away for next year faster, and you're decreasing their margins throughout the year. So they have to build that into their plan from the beginning of the year, not in the middle of the year. So you might start this in 2026, but what they're going to need to do is they're going to need to factor in higher costs throughout the year when they used to do it only one time a year. Okay? The next one is you don't know necessarily if you can afford that yet. There are going to be times when finance might go, I don't know if I can afford this. If you do it once a year, it's done. You can't pull it back, or you can, but that's more like you're going to shed staff than you're going to bring back money. You really can't pull money away from people. So it's harder. It becomes harder in quarters 3 and 4 when you've already spent quarters 1 and 2. The other thing is you're going to have to explain to people what proration means, because you're not going to give them that full year increase at one time now. You're going to give it to them in increments, and it's going to be smaller increments of pay increases, and they don't understand that. They're going to say, well, why don't you give me 3% every quarter? So it's going to be much smaller increments of pay. It's going to be 0.75 if you're going to stick with 3%. And they're going to look at that and they're going to, well, you're cheating me, even though you're not actually, you're compounding that quarter to quarter, which is another problem. When you're giving an increase all at one time, it's 3% on top of someone's current pay. When you're giving a quarterly increase, you're compounding 2, 3, and 4 on 1. So it's, sorry? It's more than 3% at the end of the year, which means finance might actually make it not 0.75, they make it something else. So there's a lot of complication for giving quarterly merit increases. Now, for those of you who use step increases, that's a payroll function, you know? Payroll knows every month or every quarter, we're going to give increases to our union staff or our to negotiated staff or whomever who are on step increases. When we reach that time period, everybody just gets that increase. If you're going to try and go to that, you might convince your leaders and your CFO to go to step instead of going to merit. Merit is burdensome, step isn't. But what does step do? It's peanut butter. It's across the board. Everybody gets it. Whether relative to, I mean, you could say that the only reason why you don't get your step is if you have underperformance, which might be less than like a 3 out of 5. But that's a good question because that is exactly what we're talking about in comp planning. It makes the process of compensation planning simpler. The problem is it's more expensive, it's harder to communicate, and it becomes more burdensome, and it actually be more expensive. It might be more expensive at the end of the day. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. I write a book series called the HR Data Doodles. I'm going to be sitting over there signing my book. It's a humorous look at HR from the lens of HR. It's kind of, think about it, the office for HR people. But I'm going to be out there signing my book in case you're interested. Also, listen to my podcast. It's called the HR Data Labs Podcast. And there's no selling on it. It's all about leadership, about everything and anything HR. Thank you very much. You've been awesome. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for listening to the HR Data Labs podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share it with your network. Also, check out the HR Data Labs Brown Bag Lunch every Friday on LinkedIn. You can also check out the recordings on Spotify. Thank you, take care, and stay safe.